you think by adding a language, you're going to get more sales because it opens up a new market, but it's going to cost you something to open up that market. So,
and the sales don't have the same buying power as your US dollar does.
Yeah.
In almost every
either
case.
more or less. You don't know, right? So it's like, okay, you just got to crush the numbers. And then at the end of the day, you're just staring at a bunch of made up numbers and you're like, sure, I don't know.
Butterscotch.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 490 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam, and I'm the artiste.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's October 18th, 22x4. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. We'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. If you'd like to help support the podcast and keep these, podcast juices flowing, you're going to head on over there and we'll grab your money. As soon as you go to that link,
just boom.
All of it. It's all gone.
Thanks.
All of it. Adam's a very good web guy, and we got lots of hacks in there. So we're just get right into your bank account and yank it right out. So,
I'm already in there, actually. So.
He's already in there. Yeah,
you should quit buying so many lattes.
Anytime Adam's not talking on the podcast, he's hacking your bank account.
Yep.
That's just how
just stealing more money. I'm basically doing it the same style as Office Space. So every podcast listener has a worm living on their computer that just takes a cent out of every transaction. It just sends it right to moneygrab.bscotch.net. So I appreciate all of the support that everybody who listens to the podcast.
You mean like Superman 3?
Or that one, that also works.
Yeah, which I recently learned. I haven't actually seen Superman 3, and I watched the pitch meeting for it. And I didn't realize, this was like in the 80s when this was made. And for some reason, the whole movie revolved around computers, where there's a guy who put together the Office Space thing of siphoning fractions of a penny, blah, blah, blah. But also, his company was using computers to control the weather, where they're just computers are fancy technology, right? They can probably control the weather. At some point, a computer just ate a woman and turned her into a cyborg robot, and it's just a regular ass computer. It's a different time,
Well, it's not that different because I rewatched Lucy the Scarlett Johansson movie, the whole because there's that whole idea that is complete nonsense of you're only using 10% of your brain, right? It doesn't, that's not a thing. That doesn't make any sense. But that's so embedded in our culture, right? That there's a whole ass fucking sci-fi movie, a recent one, built off of that, called Lucy. And I rewatched it because sometimes it's fun just to watch a dumb as shit sci-fi, and
more fi than sci.
The degree to which the science was basically the same thing as a computer eating a person, or a computer passing its virus onto a person or vice versa, the degree to which the level of science is the same as that.
I love that techno magic bullshit though. I don't know. Cause it's basically, I think it's fun whenever people start approaching it and they're like, this isn't that, it is magic, right?
Yeah.
It is old. It's magic from the old days. So why don't we just behave as such?
I think it's fun when it feels I enjoy it when it feels like the people who made it know that that's not how stuff works. When it feels like they don't know, then it makes me crazy.
When you see hackers in a TV show and they're slapping a keyboard really, really fast. Obviously nobody could possibly think that's how hacking works, right? And so then I'm this is delightfully amusing, you know. But when it's just
they might.
They might, but it's all about the vibe. If it feels like they know better and are doing it this way anyway because of convenience, or because it's funny, or because they know that the audience doesn't know, and so they're we're getting away with something. All of those I can get behind. It's the one where I earnestly feel the people who wrote it are this seems plausible.
Wasn't there one where they're hacking something? He's I need some help, and they plug in a second keyboard or something.
No, they just start typing on the same keyboard. They needed to hack faster, so they just get four hands on it.
Which is funny because plugging in a second keyboard isn't actually because you need to manage focus on an application. Plugging in a second keyboard doesn't even make less sense than that. That they're equally dumb, but being on one keyboard,
less dumb.
Yeah, exactly. So doing it on one keyboard then it feels like it comes back into intentional again because it's so
ridiculous.
It's so absurd that then it's fun to make fun of, but also I can
actually have fun, watching it unfold. But there are some things though where the science is just like so wrong, but in a way that I feel like they don't know that. They being the people who made the thing, that I just get a little angry. I just get a little angry about it,
Yeah. My beef with sci-fi is that I feel like it's a misnomer. Like people would refer to like Star Wars as sci-fi. It's like there is no science going on.
No, it's only
it's space magic, right? Like it's space fantasy. You got like basically wizards and magic in space. Like there happen to be spaceships, but they fly like airplanes for some fucking reason.
Yep.
They just like fly in space and just slow down.
The difference is the presence of hard surface metals is basically what determines.
Yeah, it's like, are there metals in spaceships? Then it's sci-fi.
It's like, does it claim it's like just how the world works, and that's not very interesting, and that's now it's like science, or do they claim that like, because I think with like Star Wars in particular, it's very clearly fantasy because they have magic. The Force is just magic. Right. And bring it into having like a scientific explanation of like the midichlorians or the fuck. Right. Like, does it make it less magic?
Right.
In that sense? Because there's still the disconnect between. Yeah. So like, I think it's fine to like add a little bit of like pseudo explanation to hook your science or to hook your magic into reality. I think that's super fun.
It's fun, but you got to make it work. Right. Because like if the Force, all right, we're going on a tangent here, but I gotta get this off my chest. Okay, so if the Force comes from stuff in your blood, some kind of concentration, then having less blood would reduce your Force powers, right? Yeah. Darth Vader lost all of his limbs and never lost any power. And also, if you were a real big, you got lots of blood, okay, you should be able to do more Force stuff if you've got, you know what I mean?
This also suggests, so I had a stem cell transplant, right? Your blood is
you could transfer the Force.
Yeah, you could actually just give people stem cell transplants, and as long as they survive the immune system response problem, then you could actually just make more Jedis.
Yeah, like that would be sick. Like if if they establish like, oh yeah, this is how the Force works, and if they actually respected that rule, and then it's like you'll see people trying to get Jedi blood and stuff like that, so that they can so that they can gain the Force, because you could do it.
Or a Jedi who trains in Colorado suddenly has way more powerful Force powers because he's training at higher elevations, got a lot more red blood cells, assuming the midichlorians.
Well, I mean, space Colorado.
Yeah, I don't know if they're. I think they're like a separate, because it's supposed to kind of like mitochondria, right? Like, are they in cells or just? I think they're just floating around in your blood, right?
Well, I think regardless of, it's a question of where they originate from.
Yeah, and how do they reproduce?
Yeah, because if they're floating around in your blood, it would be suggested that they would come from.
That they're produced
similar to. Most of those things.
So maybe they're like microplastics. They just get in you somehow. Yeah, that's true. And you can't get them out. Maybe
that's the case. But you can get them out if they're in your blood, though. Then you could get them out by
you could transfuse them out. Yeah.
Leeches,
Force leeches. All right. Well, anyway, let's get into the actual podcast. So first off, Sam has some kind of story about sleep that
it's kind of a question. Okay, which is that. Okay. So I'm wondering if this has happened to you guys. Freak me out. Which was last night. I woke up at 4 a.m. with a high-pitched pinging in my ear. So some tinnitus.
Pinging or like a tone?
A tone.
Okay. Gotcha.
I thought it was, at first I thought it was like something in the house that was doing something. And then of course I looked around, sounded change, covered my ear, sounded change. And I was like, oh, Jesus Christ. And I've had like a little bit of that every so often. Like, maybe once every couple of months, get like a tone for, I don't know, 30 seconds or a minute or something. But not very long, ever. And this fucking thing lasted. It woke me up. It was so loud. And then it lasted until like 6 a.m., which has never happened to me before. Freaked me the fuck out. And so that's basically my question.
It's going to happen again.
I know. I don't want it to happen again. I'm like, how? Yeah,
I definitely
has happened to you, and how do you deal?
I haven't had that. So I've also, I think everybody gets the ones where it's just like all of a sudden it's just like, boo. For just like a short time, for like you said, like 30 seconds, minutes, something like that. I get those every so often. I also just do have tinnitus, so I have a low level, mostly left ear, a little bit right ear, just like a low level, just like it's not quite the same as that because that one's more like a tone. My tinnitus is more like a white noise. It's like a high pitched white noise. It's kind of like what the.
I get you. I think I have the same thing.
And it's just there all the time. When I first noticed it, I don't know when it started because it's also not super loud. But when I first noticed it, it gave me intense anxiety because I was just like, oh no, this is my life now, right? And I couldn't not notice it for
months. Like it basically, and it's not even that bad, but it fucked me up for months because like I would start thinking about it again.
Couldn't stop paying
I
attention.
can hear
to
it again. Then I can't stop paying attention to it. And then again, I'm like, what if this gets worse? And then I'd have trouble sleeping because I'm like thinking about it, but also hearing it because it is like making a noise, you know? And it just really fucked me up for a while until I started to get enough used to it and that I could stop sort of
attending to it.
Yes, circling around and focusing on it. And like even now, like until you started talking about it, I forgot that my tonight, and now I'm hearing it again very clearly. But like until we started talking about it, I would actually like didn't notice it. And
well,
now
I wonder like how much of that baseline is just like, it's sort of like when you realize that there's certain things about your vision, like you, for example, can't see certain things, or like at night, for example, if you're looking around, it's better if you want to see, if you're trying to find something in the darkness, it's actually better to not look directly at it.
Look slightly to the side of it.
Yeah, because your focal point doesn't have as much. Like there's stuff like that where I wonder to what degree like everybody has sat like a small level of that like white noise happening in your ear, and then you just notice it. Does that make sense? For the first time versus like not noticing it because it's always been there, sort of.
I think it's one of those.
But this one's different where
it's
it
not
turned off.
typical, but it is common, you know, or it's like, it's not the default, but it's like a fairly frequent thing. I guess like in our youth, you know, we had a couple, there was one loud as fuck concert we went because we went to Prince when we were like teens.
It was painful.
Yeah. It like literally like for like 2 days afterwards, I had kind of like a roaring in my ears, you know? So,
This is before anyone was like, you should wear earplugs.
Yeah, take care of your hearing. And then we mowed the lawn on a big lawnmower for 4 hours at a stretch, and like, you know, we were just around a lot of loud noises a lot as kids, and we're not using ear protection.
A lot of guns too.
A lot of guns.
We grew up with a lot of guns.
Yeah, so like I don't doubt that I just have some just like
we did
low
some
level permanent damage, you know. But I know but my wife doesn't have that at all. So like when like the house gets really quiet and there's no noise outside, and that was one of the things that like fucked me up the most is I was like, I don't get to enjoy silence. Like I don't get to have that because the moment there's just like no sound, I've never been able to not hear it at that point.
There's just something going.
Yeah, there's just all of a sudden noise. And so like I need to be surrounded basically all the time by music playing, by white noise, by fans going by, whatever, right? Just to not start to hear it and then focus on it.
You gotta drown out the white noise with some white noise.
But you haven't had one that lasted like a long time.
No, I haven't had one that was just like so I get those tone ones on occasion, but I think that's a different thing. I think.
Yeah, my like default
only lasted for short times.
My like background noise one, it doesn't sound like it's as bad as yours, but I've never had that, and so that's why I was like, is this?
Am I like this now? Yeah, I've had that. I mean, I've had one for a few hours. Yeah, where it's just like all of a sudden, beep, and then I'm just like, what the fuck? You know, just trying to go about my day now, and I just can't stop hearing this squealing. And then at some point, it just stopped.
Yeah. I can absolutely see how people like just can't manage it if they have that stuff permanently that bad. Because like I don't know if I could.
I will say it's a good thing though that it isn't. It's not an intermittent signal, which I think would actually drive you completely insane.
Well, if it's just random.
Yeah, if it's like. You'd be like, I just.
Or it would stop for a while and you'd be like, oh, is it gone? And then it just come right back again. Like, yeah, that's basically torture. Like, that's what they do to deprive people of sleep, right? It's just like unpredictable tones being blasted.
Yeah. So I guess at least it's that. But maybe that's it. But that was my question. That was my story, my question.
I think it's just, something that I always have to try to appreciate is like, when you're in your 30s, biologically, you should be dead. As in like, you could be a grandpa by now and you're done now. You did your job as an organism.
Yeah, I think you mean evolutionarily.
Yeah, evolutionarily, yeah. You have
biologically,
no reason.
You're actually doing fine in your 30s.
Yeah, you're doing fine. But like, we never evolved to need to live this long, And so whatever happens at this point is just kind of on accident. And your body just is going to start kind of giving up in random ways at random times. It's just part of it. Your ears are like, I'm going to take a break for a couple of hours. Yeah. Just bring in squealing Jim from the back room. And
I think that's kind of where, to me, like that's where the horror comes in. Because I don't mind the idea of like looking old or being old. Like those concepts don't bother me like they do a lot of people, But there's a real like horror, like body horror, of the irreversibility of like some of the stuff
that starts to happen, you know? So
like,
so for me, it's like
try to keep it up, you know, where it's like, wear earplugs, man.
Well,
like,
so much of it you can't, because so much of it, like it hits, and then there are so many things that just are irreversible. Like you can't get rid of tinnitus. You can just get used to it. And like and because it can be so life fucking when you have like significant tinnitus, that there's therapy and like there's all kinds of stuff you can do to help you figure out how to like manage it. But there's like chronic pain. There's like my wife's dealing with this kind of like new onset chronic stuff that's going on, and like it's just like all of a sudden this is just how life is now, you know, where it's like things are just physically worse than they used to be, and it's going to be that way forever now. And like when those moments happen, and I've had a few of these as I've gotten, because we're not old yet, but we're getting older, you know. I've had a few of those happen where it's just like it took me a little while to adjust to be like, God, like there's like this existential horror of like,
oh yeah,
I never get to just X again, you know. It's just this just is like this now, and that's
This is why, you know, if you're young, you know, stay ahead of it. I mean, I have a lot of younger people in my WoW guild in like their early 20s, you know, and they're playing on just like a laptop on a coffee table, just hunched over it, and I'm like, you know, you may not care about ergonomics, but ergonomics is coming for you. You're getting away with this right now, but you be prepared for some real neck and back pain.
I think as much as it's the case that people complain about getting older in a variety of ways, I think it's also, there's always that thing in the back of mind for me, which is like, because it is nice to be able to, you know, get old. Just based on the experience that, you know, we had together based as a family.
But yeah, being older is great, but aging is not great. Like the process of getting there.
To me, it's the same as like dying versus being dead, right? Because people talk about being afraid of like death, like being dead. And I'm like, that doesn't bug me at all. What I'm terrified about is what is the process of getting there going to look like at the end?
What's it going to feel like when your organs stop working?
Yeah, or because when you die, things happen to cause that to be the state change, you know? So like there's all kinds of ways that you can get there, but like that's what I'm worried about, you know, because so many of them are not peaceful and chill.
So let's move to just a different topic.
You don't want to talk about aging and dying?
I'd love to, but we got a podcast we got to get through. We have some news, actually, some studio news, which if you're in our Discord, you will have seen this. But we are no longer coming to mobile through Netflix. We are now, well, we don't know yet, really. But the game still will be coming to mobile through some mechanism, which we're still figuring out. So, you know, we had a Discord post about it, and, you know, these kinds of things happen. It's an amicable separation, and they were a good business partner. But sometimes goals diverge, and it is what it is. So we're, you know, and they were a good partner to work with. But now we got a new opportunity, which is a bunch of unanswered questions. What do we want to do with the mobile version of the game? Because we don't have anybody else who already has the answer to that question.
Yep,
right.
Got to figure it out ourselves. And it's been a minute since we put something on there.
We haven't had to. And
2020.
And even in 2020 with Levelhead, we were going on to like Game Pass, not Game Pass. Well, we're on Game Pass too, but Play Pass on Google Play
all the passes
was like our big focal effort there, and we were working with Google specifically for that, and so that was one of those we were just like, oh, like kind of mobile is covered. Like in a sense, we're going to be successful there, and so we could just kind of not worry about it that much. We still had to go through all of the stuff and do the things, you know, but it didn't feel like it was that big of a deal. With Netflix, it was similar. We're just like, well, Netflix is responsible for success of the game on mobile. So we're just like, we just have to make sure it's good, but that's it. Yep. And then we're done. And now we're back in that camp of being like, okay, so now we have to try to make sure it's successful, but we actually haven't really had to do that since kind of before Levelhead even.
We haven't been thinking about it much because it's been somebody else's job for the mobile version for quite a while now, you know, and so we're kind of recalibrating, which
so we won't promise anything specific, but I will say we're looking into just launching the stores the regular ass way, right? So, because that brings us into this topic of discussion, which is we're always talking about how in game dev, there's the first hard part, which is making a game good enough that people would want to buy it. And then there's the second hard part, which is then getting it production ready so that it's it'll work on lots of devices. It's not very buggy. You can handle bugs. You're figuring out how to prevent saves from getting corrupted. You're doing that. There's a million things that go from being like a complete good hobby game to a complete good commercial product, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's the third hard thing, which is actually getting people to fucking buy it, right? Mm-hmm. And each one of those things is its own collection of hard shit. But that third one is the one where every single question does not have an answer.
Yes.
These are things like, how much do you charge for it? Who the fuck knows? Which service is going to be in? Who the fuck knows? You're going to start talking to potential business partners and publishers and whatever, right? And now you're playing this game of like, well, if we agree to exclusivity here, then we can guarantee at least we won't run out of money. But then we can't be on this thing until this amount of time later. That means we can't talk to this person yet. So I have to like make them remember, oh, I need to recontact this person 6 months after launch. You know, like it becomes all of that stuff. It's like, what languages do we support, right? There's a never-ending list of
there's like a meta level layer of stuff to figure out to actually allow you to effectively deliver the product to someone at the end of the day.
Yeah, and none of it has answers. None of it. So you just have to eventually pick something, right?
There's a lot of opinions out there, you know, about,
people
what has worked for
answers.
Yeah, and like we spend a lot of time looking at like, okay, what do similar games do? It's like, okay, well, you know, maybe like what's similar to
what's
Crashlands?
A similar game? What does that mean?
No, you already got a problem.
It's like, I don't fucking know. Like, you know, back when we launched the original Crashlands, people were very quick to compare it to Don't Starve because, hey, top down 2D art crafting, right? That's about where the similarities end, but that was the closest analog that we had. And now today it's like, well, it's similar to Crashlands too. Don't Starve. There's just it's still kind of the same thing. And so if we're looking around of like, okay, are there mobile games we can look at of like, how have they launched? What about on Steam? I don't know. And also like if they launched 5 years ago, does what they did still apply? You know?
Yeah. And then there's for any rule that somebody gives you or any like opinion they give you, right? Because we have our PR team we work with, Stride PR, and we've got people that we know and like lots of professional contexts that are like keeping their eyeballs on big picture stuff, right? And they tend to give us really similar or even the same answers about stuff because the answers they're giving us are kind of like, what is the average behavior, right? And so, which is kind of like what we tend to target too. Like that's what seems like it makes the most sense, right? But for any given rule, you can find so many outliers or so many things that break the rule and then succeed. But the question there is that an outlier for completely unrelated reasons that allowed it to break it? Or is that evidence that the rule isn't really a rule, right? And there's no way for you to know the fucking difference. And so then you're left.
If you're looking at what an average game does, you got to ask yourself, is my game an average game?
Mm-hmm. Oh, so I mean an average successful game, you know? Yeah. So
yeah.
So like if you're looking at games where like, okay, what if we priced our game at $15? Like what do games look like that are successful at $15? And does that somehow fit the vibe?
Or more specifically, games that are launching nowadays.
Yeah, nowadays.
Right.
Well, and not even necessarily because you're not competing with games that are launching now. You're competing with games that are launching now and games that are visible that have been out for a long time. You're competing with
every game that has ever been.
Well, because we're looking, for example, like I think because RimWorld, I bought it at $20 6 years ago, probably something like that. And it's $35 now, right? And there's lots of games that have kind of like
Satisfactory is a good example because Satisfactory started at 20.
Or Factorio.
Sorry, yeah. Factorio started at 20, went up to 30, and is now at 35, right? And you can see like you're looking at the game, it's like it looks like an old school like 2D top down thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so just looking at it, you feel like it's going to be a hard sell, right? And then it turned out that it wasn't. And so over time, they also added fuckloads of content over time. And then as they added content and as like it was obvious that people would pay for it anyway, they'd increase the price, right? Mm-hmm. But there's a question of if they had launched it at $35.
Well, back then that wouldn't have worked.
Probably.
But what about now?
But if they launched it now at $35, yeah. But
right? Because everything changes over time.
But how much is it that it was like cheap enough that people tried it and then it became, you know, basically a phenomenon.
Yeah.
And then once it was a phenomenon, now the price doesn't matter because people will just pay whatever to get it, right?
But then you got stuff like Terraria, which is $10 now. Like the price has gone down of Terraria. And like
because they're going on pure volume. They're just like, it's one of the most popular games of all time. We just want it to be one of the most popular games of all time. and we already have infinite money. So because there are different approaches you can take where you can say like, I want my games to be financially accessible. So I want to go as cheap as I think I can without creating a problem for myself. Right. Mm-hmm. Or you can say, I'm trying to run a business and, we need the money to survive. So I care less about like just volume and more about ensuring that I make enough money that I get to keep doing this, right? Mm-hmm. And so then you push the price up to try to like.
But again, this is assuming that changing the price changes the sales numbers.
Yeah, which isn't. We've seen in our own experiments is not true.
Yeah, because games are unique. They're like houses, right? Where like, okay, if there's one house, that like has a pool in the back, right? It's the only house in this section of town, right? You're like, I want that pool. Then like that changes the price of the house. And just because the house next to it is cheaper, that doesn't really mean anything like for the house with the pool. Like if you're willing to pay it, because like it's one of a kind, right? And so
it's one of those, it does and it doesn't, right? It's like the pool becomes this add-on where you can now justify a higher price.
You can use the other house kind of as
an anchor point. Anchored, like. So then you're like, well, if this didn't have a pool, here's what it would be. But things are more than just the sum of their parts. But
like as far as you're concerned, like you personally are either going to buy the house or you're not going to buy it.
Right.
Right. And if it costs like 10% more than the house next door, that may not change your calculus, whether it's 5% more or 20% more for you personally. If you're that hyped about what it has, then you may just like you may not be as price sensitive, right? Because of the fact that it has something unique you want.
It's actually a very unique proposition.
Yeah. It's like if I want to play Factorio and I don't want to spend $35, I can pirate it, I guess. Mm-hmm. Or what else do I buy? Yeah, I got to go on a hunt, right? Yeah. And so that's the weird, because like we've seen this where like at one point, on Steam, we reduced the price of Crashlands from $15 to $10, thinking that there was a psychological break point there where like once a game is below $10, then people will suddenly see it in like a different light and you'll get this kind of big uptick in sales. Mm-hmm. And it didn't. Yeah. Nothing happened. Like we sold the same number of copies. We just made 33% less money per sale. So we just lost a bunch of money and we didn't make the game more accessible to anybody because our sales numbers didn't really change. Right. Or maybe we made it more accessible to some people who did buy it, but then other people who would have bought it are like, oh, this game is so cheap, maybe it's bad. And they didn't buy it, right? You don't know. So like,
so basically the place we've gotten to then is with the change in the mobile strategy is basically we're back in this cave where we're back
and thinking about prices again.
What does this mean? And part of that is store management. Kind of we're going just like store management stuff.
Yeah, store management, and like we set up our Steam page, more than a year ago because that's how Steam works, right? You say Steam as an operating system is like based on you as a publisher of games on the platform getting your store page up early, getting your assets ready to go, accumulating wish lists. Like Steam is all oriented around like getting people. It's all around discovery and getting people to know about a thing. And letting them know it exists once it launches. Like it's all about that stuff, right? It's the only platform that's like that. All the other platforms
it's about launching your game.
Yeah, it's about
they have all these tools for that.
Yeah, the other platforms really kind of across the board are just like, yeah, you just put the game on here, right? And they do have mechanisms, just not nearly as extensive as what Steam does. And none of them are focused on pre-launch. They're all just like you launch the game, right?
A big reason is that the mobile stores in particular are so oriented towards free stuff that nobody really cares enough to like wish list or pre-order a free game, right? Like if when it comes out, you'll just if you remember, you'll just go download it, right? But like
so you don't have a culture of it that's established and like all this kind of stuff, right? So on Steam, there's a whole like store ops kind of like thing that like there's enormous communities around like how to have a good store page on Steam, how to kind of min-max stuff, choosing the best tags to get the most visibility. Like there's infinite resources at your disposal for like how to do a good job on Steam. And again, just like all the other stuff, it's mostly best guesses and rules that may or may not actually be true because everything is so specific to individual games. But at least you got something to work with, and you can find some things that are like you can find examples of things that are like probably actually bad.
But it feels like
tips and tricks of things you wouldn't otherwise know.
A lot of the things matter. that people are talking about, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because of the way that the games are surfaced versus on like the mobile store side, you have your long description, short description, the app
some keywords
itself, some tags, some keywords. So there is again, it's similar to a degree where like there's communities around App Store optimization, as it's called, which is like figuring out that same thing of like what jumble of things do you need to put together so that this works. But the fact that the pre-release window, they do exist now. There are pre-releases on iOS and Android.
Yeah,
but they're very short.
Android has pre-registration, which is you just like, it's basically a wish list.
Wish list, yeah.
And then the App Store has pre-purchasing, where you don't actually make the purchase. You just
purchase,
yeah. So that way, like as long as you don't cancel it, then when the game arrives, then the purchase goes through and they get the game automatically and stuff.
It just auto downloads.
Yeah, and so at least on that side, you can put up a store page now. I think it's like 6 months.
Yep,
early, something like that.
Yeah, which is actually great. Really good.
Which is that's a nice solid one. That's one of those like by the time you're doing that, you're pretty confident about your launch date and all that kind of stuff. So that's a nice enough window, but it is because Steam doesn't have a limit. They're just like, you just put it up whenever you want to.
Oh yeah.
Which is really good because of how difficult it is to know when your game's going to be done. So even the 6 month thing I don't like, because like if you start
there's a cap on it.
There's a cap and then it like starts to fuck with things, so like that's still, it makes it so that practically it doesn't make any sense to do it at the longest part of that window. You want to wait until you're really confident about your launch date, right?
Yeah, it just makes me think of that, like, where do you see yourself in 5 years, right? It's like, where do you see yourself in 6 months? I don't fucking know. Like, that's so long from now.
Yeah, I'm not a fortune teller.
How am I supposed to know what's going to be going on?
Plan. Yeah, so I think that we've switched then over to figuring this stuff out again, and part of that is building some of these tools, which we built for Levelhead. We've had some for some other, actually mainly for Levelhead was the first time we did it, where because the language is supported and because of the way that the App Store in particular works with regards to device resolutions. You have this really interesting and kind of dumb problem, which is that they require that essentially the device that someone's viewing the App Store on, so let's say I'm on an iPhone, I don't know, like one of the newest ones, one of the long boys, that the screenshots match the resolution of that device. Right. Or like the aspect ratio of that device. So you end up with this thing where you don't just take a set of screenshots, nor do you just take a set of screenshots per language, which you would have to do if you have words, but you actually have this matrix now of a set of screenshots per device per language. And so this becomes a tremendous nightmare. Levelhead had, I think, 880 something screenshots because of this thing, because in order to get all of them uploaded and like basically check all the marks to allow for featuring to happen across, say, like not just the US App Store, but then these other app stores where you have the game localized, you have to have all this stuff tight, right? It has to be all perfect.
Well, then you also need it for Steam.
And right? For Steam too, but you just need a set for Steam.
Consoles. Yeah. Well, yes, because Google Play is just like, just a 1920 by 1080. They'll keep it simple, and so they don't show you based on your device. They just show you screenshots of stuff, right? Yep. So that one's easy. That's the same as also as Steam. Like consoles and PC all are just like a normal 9:6 or 16 by 9 aspect ratio, right? Very simple. But even then, you still need, if you're like on PC and you're focusing on keyboard inputs, then you want to show the UI for keyboard input or for keyboard and mouse. If you want to focus on, again, assuming you have all these ways of interacting with the game. So we basically have, touch, keyboard and mouse, and controllers. And depending on context, you need to shit. So on mobile, it's got to only be the mobile one. So even though on Google Play we can use 9:16 aspect ratios, we have to show the mobile UI, right? So you end up with this. So basically, the complication is dimensions by input by language. Per screenshot, right? And so even just doing a little bit of testing and just like trying it out, because I was also a question. I was like, so Seth built this auto screenshotter where you just like hit a hotkey at some moment in the game and it kind of freezes everything, and then it just starts cycling through.
It just changes aspect ratio, changes language, changes control scheme.
If it looks like a hacker is taking control of your computer, this is sort of it, where it's like suddenly the Windows just like
changes size and and the font flips and stuff, which is super cool. It's slow as shit because it turns out like taking a screenshot via Game Maker, like internally, basically it's like running through pixel by pixel or something. I don't know. It's just slow as shit.
It takes like a whole second to save a screenshot.
Yeah.
Basically.
So it's like this. So it ends up being this, like, you're just like letting your computer just sit there churning through this for like a minute while it's doing it. Right. But it's a hell of a lot better than trying to like recreate the scenario. Because by the time it's done, it's taken like 100.
It would take you like 2 whole days to get one screenshot, basically, without this.
So it's still infinitely better. And so I was like playing around with stuff to make sure that I could like also, because I was like, what if I have like somebody help find screenshots? But these things have to be organized in a way that's useful, right? So they're organized into so it's like organized by the top level folder is the device type, and the second level is the language, and then inside of there are the actual named images for the screenshot, right? So that way, if you're like on a store page dealing with stuff, it's typically done within that group like that,
chunks,
right? Yeah. But then it's like, okay, well, once you have those, like let's say I take a bunch, and then somebody else on the team takes a bunch, right? And then we're like, well, can we merge these nested folders together? So like it turns out in Windows, it does it. So if you just like drop one folder into the other, if it's the same folder names and stuff, it just merges it all. So I was like, oh, that's a fucking relief. But I was like, well, what about the sort order of these, right? Because you're naming them based on what's in there, like as you take a screenshot, right? But you want to be able just to like drag drop the whole thing to upload it, or use an automated tool that talks to an API or something to do it. Either way, you want to decide what the order of your screenshots is, because that does matter when you're presenting this stuff to people. So it's like, okay, how do we deal with that now? Because you're going to go through this process of like getting screenshots and then deciding which ones you want to keep, and then deciding what order they're going to go in. And you have to have some way to do that, right? And there's just like this never-ending set of problems like this where, again, there's no good answers.
A factorial.
But everything explodes. It's then when you're trying to do things like, so like right now, we're trying to figure out how we're going to deal with mobile, like how we're going to launch the game, if it's going to sim ship, if we're going to sell it directly, if we're trying to decide all of that stuff. And we're talking to potential partners, like we're doing all of that stuff, right? While we're doing that, we want to make sure that those partners can evaluate stuff in a way where they don't leave with the wrong impression that like the game's not good or not done or whatever, right? And so we kind of like already need the store pages to be good on mobile, but they need to be just good enough for like internal review, not good enough for like public consumption. But it's one of those, it's so costly to just do a temporary job, right? Because you're just like, yeah, we just need a few decent screenshots.
Freaking screenshots.
Yeah, because that even at this point, it's like, oh, like, is it even worth doing? Or do we just like try to find people to talk to and only talk to them as people and be like, hey, yeah, our store page isn't set up. It will be, just trust us on that. Just focus on the game. I try to figure out what the move is there.
I think you got to do it parallel in this case, which is like we have close enough relationships, luckily, at this point.
Yeah, you just do both.
Yeah, that we could just kind of go. But I think it is one of those, again, getting back into the high level thing, which is like you get into game dev to make games, almost like no matter what across the board, right? Whether you end up doing the art side of things, the QA side of things, the programming side of things, but you're only ever doing like a piece of it in the first place. But then beyond that, especially when you're running your own shop, you're doing a lot more stuff that is just like, it's not even a piece of the game. It's a piece of the apparatus that allows you to exist because you made the game, right? Or that allows you to sell the game in the first place. And every so often, like depending on how much of that you're doing or how detached you have to get from the game itself, it can just be a little like, I'm sure Adam's the one who's been dealing with most of the stuff. And like, you could have a week or two go by where you're just doing all this stuff and you're just like, God damn it.
I think it's like the game dev equivalent of like when you're going about your life, you want to, just like watch shows, play games, hang out with your friends, but you still got to sleep and poop and eat and like do all this maintenance crap that
pay bills,
just keeps taking so much time, but like if you don't do it, then you just die. So you got to keep doing all this boring, annoying stuff so you can go about, the rest of your life.
Yeah, and it's tempting to try to be like, well, I don't want to do any of that, so let me find a publisher to do that for me.
Let me just not sleep.
And the reality is like publishers actually don't know. Like if publishers knew how to just make a game successful by taking the right screenshots, talking to the right people, and putting up the good store page, they would all only launch successful titles. That's not what any publisher does. Some publishers
and they would always give you money.
Good, and they would always
because they would know that it would give them a return.
Yeah, but the reality is nobody knows. Nobody knows how to price a game. Nobody knows how to set up a good store page.
The benefit the publishers have is that they get to take more shots than everybody else. Yeah. So if they're smart people and if they're doing their job correctly, then ideally they're statistically leaning toward more success more of the time.
And that they do have answers, like not just the right, because having an answer versus having a right answer are not the same thing, right? But they do have answers. They're aware of the questions, which is the first hard part, right?
Yes.
And they have decided on answers via their experience, via the best guesses or whatever, right? And so for good or for ill, things are going to happen that you basically get to not worry about, right? So they'll just they'll tell you what they need. They'll be like, hey, we need a bunch of pictures at this resolution. They'll just tell you what they need and then sort it out, right?
You basically
whether that's good or bad.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like someone's thought about this.
Yeah, and this is such a thing you got to be careful, because I've been thinking about this with because we've hired Stride PR as a PR firm to help with like the final push up through launch to figure out how to. What are the final beats? Basically. What is the final messaging? Yeah. How do we let people know the game's coming out? That kind of stuff, right? But we have to be really careful with that relationship, because it's so tempting for me to just be like, hey, would it be better if we did this or that, and have them give me an answer and me just be like, cool, they gave me an answer, so I'm just going to use that, right? It's so tempting to just do that.
It would be nice to be able to like completely turn over responsibility, right?
And most people do. Yeah. Most people do when they hire third-party experts to do something, right? You just have to remember that there aren't actually known correct answers in this domain. And so nobody can have a right answer. That's not how it works. What people can give you is like, here's what we think we've seen. When this happened, we saw this. When this happened, we saw that. They can give you those typically anecdotal, sometimes data, but usually the data is so rough, I would just call it anecdotal still, right? They can give you some sense of like what they've seen and kind of give you more inputs to work with. But those can also end up just being like more biases all over again, right? So especially because things tend to bias towards like what feels the safest, what feels the kind of most average, right? Then those are the answers that you're going to get from experts, because that's what they see that tends to work. You're going to see the statistical average of kind of everything, right? And part of what I liked about bringing on a third party was being able just to get answers to things, right? But part of the struggle I've had to constantly pay attention to, is differentiate when I just kind of need an answer, and we all know that there isn't a right one. We just have to do something, right? Right. And in those scenarios, not having to just spend like a whole fucking day being like, oh, between these three things that there's no way to decide meaningfully which one of these to do, which one should I do, and instead just having someone to be like, well, I don't know, best guess based on our experience is this one. And I'll be like, cool, I can't do a better guess, you know? Yep. So like
that makes enough sense to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So differentiating those scenarios of like having somebody help guide decisions by providing useful sort of context and background versus turning over decision making to somebody else. And like when you're doing that is a thing to be extremely careful of. And what a lot of especially indies who don't want to deal with the whole publishing business as we've just described, it's a lot. I fully understand not wanting to do it. We also don't want to do it, right? So I fully understand that. But and we like, as we're nearing the end of Crashlands 2, this topic comes up a lot of like, we've now spent 4 years making this thing. We need to give it every opportunity to be successful when we put it out. And there are all these avenues where we're like, oh, well, we could maybe save some money if we don't do this. We could maybe turn over decision-making to somebody else so we just don't have to worry about it. Like all the things that we don't want to be doing become really tempting at the end, right? But at the same time, that's the worst time to just turn over decision-making to somebody else or not do some things because like, what if it doesn't pan out or whatever, you know? And it kind of all is part of the same puzzle.
Yeah, it's where either your overconfidence in the product turns around and bites you because you're like, well, it's really good, so it's just kind of like it doesn't really matter too much, you know.
Yep.
Or you're just the fatigue of having been working on the thing for a long time and now having to do a bunch of things that are not directly
not what you signed up for.
Yeah. Either one of those it really can enter in and just punch you right in the face as you get right over the finish line for this thing. You just get like, you know, body slammed because it's so easy to pull back at this last moment. And I think that's kind of the trick of where we're at and where we're trying to stay at. It's just really stay on it because we got to own all the decisions all the way through, you know?
Yeah.
Because the other day, you don't want to spend 5 years doing something and then be like, and then we pulled back at the last minute and now who knows if that's the reason why I didn't do well or whatever, it's like, fuck.
Yeah. I always like to use the metaphor of the person running a marathon and, in the 100 yards leading up to the finish line, they like put their arms out and they're like, yeah, I fucking did it. And then they just trip over their own leg and then flop over and then 10 people pass them. And it's like, you went so far.
Finish the race first.
Commit,
Okay.
bring it home, then take a breather,
And so all that is to say, this part is rough and sucks, and we know it. Everybody who does this stuff knows it. If you're trying to make and publish games for a living, like you gotta be preparing for this part because it's brutal. And what's so fun about game dev is the unknowns, because you get to decide stuff based on like your taste and preferences, where you're like, oh, it'd be really cool if, and you get to decide here's how the game's gonna work. You can get people's feedback and decide like, I care or don't care about the feedback or whatever. There's still no right answers in game dev and design, right? But there are things that are clearly worse and things that are clearly better and things that are probably a side grade. But ultimately, it's just you being like, I would like it, right? I would like it if it was like this. And then when you switch into this mode of like, it's all unknown and unanswerable, but not in a fun way. There just aren't answers.
Yeah.
Like
there are questions you don't want to even have to be answering. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because you're like, I don't know how to even.
You don't know? Yeah.
I don't know. Do I have to make the language? Do I have to put this language available? How important is like controller support and menus? Does it have to be important? I want it to not be important.
And even when we're looking at languages, it's just like, okay, how much is it going to cost to translate it? How big is the market there? What price can we sell the game at? And that kind of suddenly this like combination of things. And it's like, okay,
fuzzy.
At the end of the day, it's a cost benefit, right? If like you think by adding a language, you're going to get more sales because it opens up a new market, but it's going to cost you something to open up that market. So,
and the sales don't have the same buying power as your US dollar does.
Yeah.
In almost every
either
case.
more or less, you don't know, right? So it's like, okay, you just got to crush the numbers. And then at the end of the day, you're just staring at a bunch of made up numbers and you're like, sure, I don't know.
Yeah, which we did. Like I spent basically 2 days just like putting together a pretty as robust of an analysis as you could put together for the question of like, what is our best guess for sort of ROI on each language, right? It's like taking data from original Crashlands, taking data from our wish lists in Crashlands 2 and our demo players in Crashlands 2. But unfortunately, unfortunately, fucking Steam only reports things by country, which is so country is useful for conversion rate questions, right? But what's more useful for knowing what languages you support is what fucking languages people are using. And and most countries are not like the United States, where it's like pretty predominantly one language.
Monolingual.
Right? Very monolingual. Most other places are, and even the United States actually isn't that, because like we have a huge either Spanish only or Spanish preferentially speaking population, right?
Yeah, but what you don't know is, are they buying games?
Yeah, because that's the other part of exactly. You don't know.
I don't know.
So then I'm trying to like map, given like a Steam reports, like, okay, in this country you've had X many wish lists, right? So I'm like, okay, how do I convert that into best guess the languages that people are going to be needing the game to be in versus just wanting the game to be in, given that people are often bilingual in lots of places, right? And so I put this huge analysis together. Like I went through every single country on the list that had at least, like 10 some like threshold of wish list, so I could throw away the ones that, because it's a lot, and then I'm like, okay, so I'm going through like the CIA fact book, because they have like reports on countries and stuff.
This is game dev, baby.
And they're like, yeah, in this country, like the languages spoken are based like this percentage this percentage that, and like this many people are bilingual and whatever. I'm trying to go through and be like, okay, so I'm like breaking down all these different countries.
And it's become a quant.
By rough language. But what I don't know is like, because languages like are things that also represent sort of things that are established biases within countries and stuff, right? So, because if you have like a large immigrant population that tend to speak one language, there's also a high likelihood they're marginalized by society and therefore probably aren't like on a rig playing PC games, right? So it's not as simple as that either.
Or on the flip side, if you got like for example, if you speak English and you're in Germany, then you're probably more educated and have more money and blah blah. But do you speak lots of languages? Do you play games?
Yeah, but he doesn't really play games. Yeah, so it's this, again, all unanswerable, and you can do a whole bunch of like best guess work. But in the end, all you're really doing is being like listing out your assumptions, trying to get a sense of like how uncertain
these things are, right? Trying to have like low versus high metrics, like trying to understand what your uncertainty is. And so like in our case, I have kind of like a best guess. Because also the question that you have is what would be the difference if we did or didn't have the language, right?
How many people would buy it anyways from this country?
Yeah, because even if you don't even if it's looking at Germany, for example, right? If you don't support German, or I guess if you start supporting German but only were in English previously, right? How many new people would you add that wouldn't have bought the game if it wasn't in German, right?
Because that's actually what you care about.
Because that's what you care about for localization, right?
And you just don't know.
And you can't know. And
too fuzzy. It's all fuzzy.
And there's a lot of surprising things in there because also Steam itself, because we're talking about like country within country biases and demographics and stuff, right? But then Steam itself has its own biases, right? Because it is a PC gaming platform on basically for Windows, basically, right?
And it started in the U.S.
In the U.S. It's still the main one, right? But there are certain countries that like where like GOG is a lot more popular than Steam is, right? And so different people with different life experiences in different contexts are also going to have a different relationship to like Steam and the kinds of games they play and whether or not they even buy games in the first place or whatever, right?
So you see why it's tempting to just have someone be like, do it in these languages. Shut up.
And,
and
that's what everybody does. Right? That's
you trust that they know. They don't know.
After looking at this, it's like no one does. I mean, we're doing this analysis frontwards, backwards, adding like a bunch of different stuff in there, and at the end of the day, you get this. There's a fuzz to the whole thing, where there's certain places where you could tell that, like, yes, if you don't have a language, like Japan, for example, if you don't have it in Japanese, you are not able
Japanese
to reach
will not
that
play
audience.
it.
Okay. Most other places. Very hard to tell exactly how fuzzy that like percent of people who wouldn't buy it otherwise actually is. And so you're just playing this fucking guessing game the whole time.
Well, we're also looking at Steam data overall of like how many like people from given countries are like playing games on Steam. And of course, this is a circular problem. So like if you speak Swahili and you open up Steam and there are 0 games in your language.
Yeah. Then
are you going to open up Steam again? No, you're never going to open it. You're like, well, I guess this isn't for me, right? And so then if then like later on you're looking through languages to support and you look at that language, you're like, oh yeah, nobody gives a shit about playing games on Steam in that language, apparently, I guess, right? It's like, no, maybe they do, but they've just never been included before. Yeah. And so you have these biases.
And that's why there's a strong English bias on Steam because it was
so much stuff is already on English.
Because almost everything on Steam is in English, right? Not everything, but almost everything is. And a huge fraction of that is sort of English first, right? And a significant fraction of that is English only, right? And so if you are a non-English user, or if you don't read English fluently, then when you're on Steam, you're going to have a really weird experience, right? Where
it's just a lot less stuff
depending on the game you look at, it may or may not be in your language. It might be you might list several languages because on Steam you can be like, oh, here's my language preferences, but I can see things in like let's say Spanish as an example, right? So they're like, let's say you're LATAM Spanish, right? So you're like, that's my language. But you also see that lots of games support Spanish, but not LATAM Spanish, right? So then you're like, well, I'll add that as a secondary so that I can at least see those games and that, right? Because I can't read it like as well, but at least it's like close enough to my actual language that like I can understand what's going on. And so lots of people who aren't sort of English first on Steam are having that kind of experience, which means again also that the whole platform is going to tend to kick people out who aren't comfortable seeing fuckloads of English stuff, right? and getting English only game is even, right?
And so to be clear, like it's not our job and we don't have the ability to like I said, if someone in Swahili boots up Steam, it's not like they're going to boot it up because Crashlands 2 is in Swahili for like
we probably can't bring people to Steam.
Yes,
no, exactly. We can't. So we do still have to respect the inbuilt biases that are already there and kind of try to surf those waves.
So this is the kind of shit that we gotta solve at the end of the day when you're like about to bring the game to platforms, which is just
well, especially because it's not just
all the questions.
It's just also not ROI based either, right? Because there's also, can you afford it is always the first question. So it's, can you afford it?
does it look like it's got a decent ROI? If it doesn't, are there other like sociopolitical reasons why it would be a bad idea to not support a thing,
or a good idea,
or a good idea to support something that otherwise like seems like it wouldn't have a positive direct financial return? It's like one of those languages historically. I think it's not so true now, but historically, Italian was an interesting candidate because like for forever the languages you were recommended to localize your game into was abbreviated as EFIGs, right? So English, French, Italian, German. And
Spanish.
Every time I saw that list,
Yep.
and Spanish, sorry, yeah, Spanish.
Yeah.
And every time I saw that list, I'm like, why is Italian in here? Because it's not that Italian's like, Italian doesn't have nearly the breadth of being spoken around the world as the rest of those languages.
It
Like,
also
Not
doesn't have
that big of a market.
It's not a huge gaming population. So like,
and not a huge gaming population, right? So it's like a weird. I was always like, why is that in there? And the answer I would always find or was given by people was that there's actually a higher than average like sort of density of like PC gaming or gaming in general in the Italian population, which was like part of it. But the bigger part was that there was a weirdly high proportion of publications that impact your Metacritic score.
Yep.
Are in Italian, right? So
A lot of Italian reviewers, and like every Italian gamer is a reviewer.
Yeah, professional.
apparently, I guess, yeah. So then the reason that you're supporting Italian is less because of like the ROI on the game, like on direct sales of the game, but more on overarching visibility of the game and like the broader sort of media landscape, and in particular Metacritic scores, right? Yep. And I think that's become a lot less true. So you're starting to see Italian less and less on games, but now you see like simplified Chinese is on. I was kind of doing a survey too. Like, what are games doing on Steam these days, right? And like everybody's doing simplified Chinese now because simplified Chinese and
English are the two that are obviously make all the sense in the world when you look at both the buying
and they're
power.
neck and neck on Steam. It's 30. Yeah, like it flips. They keep on kind of flipping back and forth, but they're basically equal populations on Steam. But the simplified Chinese population just like keeps on becoming more likely to be the one on top. You know.
China has, they've got a rapidly growing middle class with more leisure time and more purchasing power. Like 10 years ago, people generally described China as like rapidly developing, but still developing, right? And like now they're just blowing everybody out of the water with all kinds of crazy shit that they're doing. Like they're just building bullet trains and going to space, and they're doing
it's an enormous, powerful market.
And it's 4 times the population of the U.S. or something.
Yeah, but historically, like when we launched original Crashlands, it was a small proportion of Steam. And now today, 8 years later, it's the most popular language on Steam, right? So, so this stuff is changing over time, but it's never. There is no way to like turn it into a simple question, like ever.
Well, you also have this very funny thing, I think, which is true, which is that there's certain rules about simplicity here, right? Which is that a game like Crashlands 2, for example, has a fuckload of words. So deciding to localize it at all is just like a costly fact. It adds a lot of dev time, adds a lot of other time, janks up production such that you have
no
to
spoken voice lines, thankfully.
Yeah. No spoken words.
That would, that's a nightmare.
But just the fact that we have all that. And you have to ask the question at the end of the day, like, okay, if there are other games who have been very, very successful just in English when they launched, do we really have to do this, right? And I think, again, it's one of those wrinkly ones where it's like.
I think it's the same as cross-platform, right? In the sense that, like, it is possible to have a game in, like, on one platform in one language that ends up being successful. But what's also definitely true is you're cutting out huge swaths of the potential market. So if it ended up being successful, it would have been much more successful if you had access to these other markets. And I think and I always think back to Crashlands. The only reason we're here today, is because we launched Crashlands as a cross-platform title on mobile and on Steam, which each one of those basically made up 1/3 of our revenue, roughly, right? If we were missing any one of those, we wouldn't have made it.
Yep.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have made
a different conversation.
Yeah. And with the language, and actually once we added simplified Chinese to Crashlands, like that didn't change Crashlands that much at the beginning. But today, the bulk of the revenue we make on Steam, period, is from the Chinese version of Crashlands, original Crashlands, right? And if we hadn't done that, there wouldn't already be a huge market waiting for Crashlands 2. Because right now, the biggest wishlist pool we have for Crashlands 2
is the simplified Chinese market,
yep.
right? And none of this would have happened.
I guess my point is there's a future orientation that is involved in any localizing. So basically anything where you're doing more than like single platform, single language.
Yep.
Where what you're able to do is basically take a game that, let's say, may have done well, but not actually well enough for you to, like, I don't know, build a team and hang out for 10 years. But maybe a couple of years runway, something like that. And in the case of like just a single language, single platform, you can have the success, do something else afterwards, right? You add localization, you add like cross-platform, you add all these things to make it more likely that the total success level on in any given platform doesn't need to be so big for you to be able to ride that whole thing out for a much longer window. This is what we're trying to do, right?
Just diversify that portfolio.
But it does go the other way because of the cost of doing.
That's what I'm saying. Right? Yeah.
Because,
so it's
because they're all multipliers. Like it's because each market does behave differently, but it's like you can do substantially better in one market than another.
Well,
right?
and
that's true.
And like we saw with the original Crashlands, you can, and what most people do is stagger. It's like you do the basically mono-platform, mono-language thing. And if it is successful enough, then you bother, right? With languages, with ports, with everything else. And there's some wisdom to that too, right?
Yep.
There's the reality is like, it's just kind of a choice about how you want to go about doing your business stuff. And certainly every time we hit the end of dev on stuff, especially when we're dealing with the stores, then part of me is just like, man, just Steam
to just do one
English.
language, one control scheme, one platform.
And then like if it goes well, then we just rapidly drop all this other stuff in. Like first time.
And the problem, of course, is if it doesn't, then now the question is, did it not go well?
Yep.
Did it not go well enough, but would have with the proportional increase you would get from all these other markets? And now you've gone from it being like, oh, you made it, to being like, oh, fuck, now we're toast and we're out of runway.
Now we still have to do this stuff post-launch anyways, even though it didn't go that well, but maybe it will go well.
So again, welcome to game dev, where it's not fun and games.
Nothing is real and the points don't matter.
There's no answers to any questions.
Yeah. If somebody confidently gives you an answer to any of these questions,
they are wrong. Yeah.
They
might be right, but it's incidentally.
Right. Yeah. On accident.
This is the idea. This is the idea of bullshit, which we talked about in the past too, right? The definition of bullshit as a concept is an independence from truth or falsehood, right? It's basically a statement.
The truth isn't known, so nothing.
Well, the
is
truth
true
might
or
even
lies.
be known, but in the statement's case, right? It's just not relevant to the statement being made. When it comes to any statement, any claim about best practices for like all of game dev. And there's some things that are like unambiguously obvious, like yes, you should have a Steam page, right?
Yeah,
there are some things, but most
English,
things,
probably put it in Chinese.
Yeah,
probably.
You really should.
But also, again, depends on what you got. I don't know what you're working with, so I'm saying probably because I don't know how stack your dev team is. But like,
it's never that simple.
It's all tricky.
Yeah. So it's crazy. We're in an interesting time, and we'll keep figuring things out, and we'll keep posted. So that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, you can just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the podcast archives. And if you haven't yet, head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. It'll help boost it for launch. And as we just discussed, we could use some help because we don't know what the fuck is going on anywhere, ever. So just get on in there and give it a wish list. We'd appreciate it. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye. Bye.